and welcome to Novara Live on a concerningly warm May Day. I am Dalia Gebrial and I'm going to be joined by Stephen Methven. Stephen, how are you doing?
Hey, Dalia, I'm all right. How are you? In fact, I'm actually particularly good because today my, I think, new favourite colleague, Ceci, brought me my first ice lolly of the season, which was delicious and much needed.
So, coming up tonight, we have the FA has banned trans women from competing in women's football. Tensions escalate between India and Pakistan over a massacre in Kashmir. And Irish hip-hop trio Kneecap are having their gigs cancelled. Stay tuned for all of that. And if you'd like to support our work, you can sign up at novaramedia.com/support. And as always, make sure to let us know your comments in the YouTube chat, or you can tweet at us on the hashtag Novara Live. Polls opened across England this morning as local elections, mayoral elections, and even one parliamentary by-election take place. There are 1,600 council seats up for grabs, 6 mayors, and in Runcorn and Helsby, a new MP will replace former Labour member Mike Amesbury, who lost his seat for doing this. Yep, that was former Labour MP punching a constituent to the ground. Now, these aren't the biggest set of local elections, but they're maybe the most important we've seen in decades. And that's because they're likely to show that the two-party system in England is over. So a possible RIP to the chokehold the two major parties have had on this country for as long as any of us can remember. Now, it's important to note that there aren't that many councils with a large number of Labour seats being contested in these elections. That doesn't mean losses won't indicate something, however, about the national mood when it comes to the Labour Party. But there are a lot of Tory seats that are up for grabs, and it isn't looking good for them. According to The Telegraph, the Tories are expecting to lose control of every Tory council being contested in these elections. In other words, a wipeout. That article goes on to say this. A confidential memo to Kemi Badenoch, seen by The Telegraph, predicts that the Tories will lose up to 770 seats and all the mayoral elections that are taking place. The document said that the Conservatives expect Reform UK to pick up 500 seats and win the Runcorn by-election, with the Tories slumping to third. Recent polling seems to back that up. This is from Politics UK. As you can see, they project Reform winning 522 of the councillor seats on the ballot, so a third of them. And that's from a base of 0 seats. And both the Lib Dems and the Greens are set to double their seats, ending up with just over 400 and just under 80, respectively. But the really, really interesting thing here is that these polls show no gains for either of the major parties. And if this poll is right, Labour could lose around a third of their seats, with the Tories losing half of theirs. Now, we can't comment on the accuracy of that polling, and other polls do show a slightly different result. This is from Britain Elects. They also forecast big losses for the Tories, but some gains for Labour, the Lib Dems and the Greens. But once again, it's Reform who are making up most of the ground and almost catching up to Labour and the Lib Dems in terms of seats. Now, polls are just polls, but it's clear that there's a good chance the Tories, followed by Labour, are going to be the big losers in these elections. And it also shows that the right in England are undergoing a transformation, coalescing around a party that is in many ways on the extreme end of conservatism. Last night, Reform's leader, Nigel Farage, sat down with Sky's Beth Rigby, and he made an interesting point about how he understands this moment for his own party.
We are moving potentially from the two-party system genuinely to a multi-party system, and it's not just you. Tomorrow it's also the Greens and the Lib Dems. What's your greatest risk? What's the biggest risk for you as this changes potentially?
The biggest risk is succeeding at winning mayoralties, perhaps winning control of county councils and not delivering.
Not delivering, then it going wrong.
And then if we don't deliver, they'll say, they're just like the Labour.
Why do you worry about not delivering? What is it? Not
because
the right
that
people,
is the
not
trust.
The right structure?
No.
Not the right policies?
That is the trust that needs to be re-established in this country. One of the main reasons we're doing so well at the moment, maybe I'm doing so well at the moment, is because we've lost faith completely in the two parties that have basically dominated our lives since the end of the First World War. People want us because we represent change.
In terms of mayoral elections, there are 4 existing posts being contested. They are the West of England, Cambridgeshire and Peterborough, North Tyneside and Doncaster. Labour is broadly expected to hold North Tyneside. It also has a chance of holding Doncaster, where Ros Jones has been in the post since 2013 and she is running again. But there are likely upsets elsewhere. According to YouGov polling from last week, Mary Page of the Green Party is leading the West of England, with Labour's Helen Godwin a few points behind. The incumbent is Dan Norris, who is also MP for North East Somerset and Hanham. He's currently suspended from the Labour Party and also from his office after being arrested on rape and child sex offences. If Page takes it, that will be a major victory for the Green Party. In the Cambridgeshire and Peterborough race, the Tories were far ahead earlier this week, with Reform coming second. Labour's Nick Johnson won the seat in 2021, but has said he'll be stepping down. There are also 2 new mayoralties being contested. In Greater Lincolnshire, a familiar face is standing, though for a different party. Former Tory MP Andrea Jenkins is perhaps best known for giving the finger to the electorate following Boris Johnson's resignation. Last year, she jumped ship to Reform and she's been doing pretty well. She's leading the polls for new Mayor of Lincolnshire, with other parties trailing pretty far behind. Reform is also standing another well-known face in the Hull and East Yorkshire mayoral election. Luke Campbell won gold in the bantamweight boxing contest at London's 2012 Olympics. Since then, he's turned to politics and joined Reform. Recent polling puts Campbell well in the lead for the new mayoralty. And finally, there's the Runcorn and Helsby by-election, where the race between Labour's Karen Shaw and Reform's Sarah Poshin is likely to be tight. A YouGov poll on Tuesday put Reform at 26% and Labour at 23%. Stephen, is the 2-party system dead?
I don't think it's quite dead, but I do think that Nigel Farage really knows what he's doing. If you go back to that interview with Beth Rigby and she says, what is the biggest risk for you? And he says, not delivering. People are voting for change. If we don't deliver, we'll have failed them. And she can't really understand his answer. She means, what do you mean? Like wrong policies, wrong structures? And he just says, no, not delivering. That's why people have lost trust in politics. And he's completely right. Now, whether he's going to be able to deliver, and of course these are largely local elections, is another question. But he's right about the stakes for a small party like his. People won't really tolerate it for a long time if they don't see some differences made in their local councils, for example. So I think we are going to see a big victory for Reform tomorrow. I don't like their policies, but I also do think that there is something kind of, and people aren't going to like this, kind of exciting about it. And I don't mean like, the overheated excitement of, pundits or, mainstream media journalists who are just excited by everything. I mean, I'm kind of excited by it because I think it shows a path by which the 2-party system can be broken up by other small parties other than Reform. Because Reform's strategy has really been to take advantage of a kind of Tory agenda that was put forward by the last government, an agenda that demonized asylum seekers, that moved asylum seekers to smaller communities, to hotels in smaller communities, so that they were like present to voters, and then made promises about further demonization of asylum seekers and removing them and so forth that they just weren't able to deliver on. If Reform were to get into power in the next general election, they probably also wouldn't be able to deliver on those promises, at least not in the way that they say they're going to. But in the meantime, they're building up a head of steam because the Tory party is not trusted for having failed on these issues. Reform is trusted because they're just simply saying that they won't fail on those issues. I mean, there are some other policies in the air which I think also appeal to things like economic degradation of our towns and indeed of all of us that's happened over the last 15 years that Reform again is saying they're going to tackle. The proof of that will ultimately be in the pudding. But the path is a really good one for other small parties on the left, for example, either a new left-wing party, if there ever is one, or the Greens, or some coalition of people on the left with the Greens or entering the Greens, which is to look really carefully at where Labour is going to be failing over the next Parliament, to be looking really carefully at the promises that Labour has made. And we can already see that, the breaking of maybe not promises that they wrote down, but certainly doing things which are against Labour values, like maintaining the two-child benefit cap, removing the winter fuel allowance, attacking people with disabilities and long-term illnesses. Those are Labour failures, and those kinds of failures are going to keep rolling on, because, of course, the promise that Labour has made is that those sort of attacks on the poor will ultimately help to regenerate the country economically. Labour is just using a busted economic model, which means that that's not going to happen. So those are very distinct. There's a kind of moral failing, a policy failing, and there's an economic failing that we're going to see in Labour's future. And I think that the lesson to learn from reforms having done really so well, if it wins the kinds of seats it's projected to win in this local election, it'll have done so from having zero. The path to track there is this idea of, okay, grab on to like the policy promises or the moral promises of the party that you're really attacking, which in this case is the Tories. In the left-wing case, it would be Labour, and make those promises, and make those arguments that convince people that you're going to be able to keep those promises, and hopefully be able to actually keep those promises in the left-wing case, because Farage is right. If you don't deliver, you'll be out. So, yeah, I think that, with some organisation on the left, and I know that not everyone on the left thinks that electoral politics is important. I happen to think it is important. So with some organisation on the left, looking dispassionately at what reform has done, there is a sort of strategy there that could be emulated quite successfully, so long as you have the materials to deliver. I think Farage is right. I think the risk for reform is actually winning seats, because that means they have to prove that they have what it takes to fulfill the promises that they've made, and I don't think they will. But it'll be the same risk for the left, and they just have to make sure that they are able to follow up on those promises, should such a party or coalition come into being.
Yeah, I think that's a really important analysis. I think that, look, there are going to be some parts of UKIP, the Brexit Party reforms trajectory, that could be replicable for a left-wing party. There are also others that won't be. I think one problem that we often face is that Nigel Farage's success has largely been a project of the establishment media. The guy, despite having not won an election until very recently, a national UK election, he obviously won European elections, but a man who had no democratic basis, essentially, other than being an MEP, has been shoved down our throats as the main anti-establishment candidate during a period of political and economic decay for years now, in a way that just doesn't happen for the main left-wing party we have, which is the Green Party, despite the Green Party actually having an elected MP in Caroline Lucas. When you think about the fact, I think when Farage went up to Scunthorpe and said, we should nationalise steel, and the whole mainstream media followed him and, hailed him as a hero of the workers, as if the Green Party or the left of the Labour Party have not always been talking about nationalising these industries. But when they go and do a photo op in these communities, but also communities where they actually have got many of the members of the Green Party have organising history within it, it's not something that we see plastered over the front pages. It's not something that's hailed as a sea change in the kind of political dynamic of the country. So that is one thing that is not replicable, and I think is an important part of the success of Nigel Farage and the success of his political projects, is the way in which he has been kind of both heroized in many ways, as well as at some points, people find him quite revolting, but nonetheless has been heroized by our media as a true anti-establishment figure, when, of course, when you actually look at a lot of the economic policies or the Labour policies of reform, these are not pro-worker policies. We are talking about shredding Labour protections. We are talking about introducing the private sector into parts of our economy that have not been privatised, the NHS being one of those things. So I think it's really important for us to take those differences seriously and think about, where do we get our story out there very powerfully, in a way that does not just rely on mainstream media to co-sign the left, because they are much less likely to co-sign the left than they are to co-sign the right. But I also think that he is right, as you say, Stephen, for being concerned about what will happen if he actually wins. Because when it comes to the economic situation, I'm on the, much like with Trump, a lot of the domestic sort of policies around like immigration and trans people, it's easy to go quite hard line on those areas, and to a great amount of cost, to human rights and legal protections. But when it comes to the economy, so many of the problems that we are having in this country economically are part of a global story. Inflation is not going down anytime soon. The cost of living is not going down anytime soon. And that is in many ways because of the global shocks, things that are not really in the control of a national government. So really the only way that a national government can respond in that context, given that it can't curb many of those external shocks, is to take measures to make the domestic population resilient to those shocks. And that involves massive levels of investment in state infrastructure. And the reform that I know, the Nigel Farage that I know, the right wing that I know of this country is not willing to do that. It is not willing to implement, a genuine wealth tax to raise the revenue to put towards a really subsidized, good social security system to hold the fact that for so many people in this country, economic inactivity is not a choice. It is something that is produced by the fact of underemployment, by the fact of precarity, by the fact that so many of things that are meant to make work more accessible for those who struggle to find work, so many of those institutions, those services have been stripped away. So that question of investing in local resilience, which is, in my view, the only way that you can protect people from external economic shocks that are not within the remit of the British government, I can't see that as a policy program that Reform are willing to undertake unless they radically change their approach to economics. But I just can't see that happening because of who Nigel Farage is, and given that, he is the kind of figure, the character that is holding this whole thing together, and, who Reform, just the fact of the right wing. That's just not what the right wing does, right? I mean, they backed the Reform, at least Rupert Lowe backed disability cuts, said that we need to go even further. That's not the kind of policy that is going to materially improve people's lives. So yeah, it's a difficult one. I don't know. Unfortunately, we're probably going to find out how it's going to go, because he's probably going to do really well, both in the upcoming elections and, unfortunately, in the national elections as well. The Football Association has announced a ban on trans women competing in women's football. This follows the landmark Supreme Court ruling, which stated that the definition of a woman in the Equalities Act is limited to so-called biological women, effectively stripping the rights of trans women to be protected as women. Other sports organisations that have made similar announcements include the Ultimate Pool Group, a professional body for 8-ball pool, the England and Wales Cricket Board, and World Athletics. The FA is the latest in a series of organisations to announce a hardline enforcement of the ruling. Others include Barclays Bank, which confirmed that it will not allow trans women to use women's bathrooms in its buildings. This comes after interim guidance issued by the EHRC, which states that trans women should, quote, not be permitted to use the women's facilities in workplaces or public-facing services like shops and hospitals. Following the announcement, the FA made the following statement. We understand that this will be difficult for people who simply want to play the game they love in the gender by which they identify, and we are contacting the registered transgender women currently playing to explain the changes and how they can continue to stay involved in the game. There are currently 30 trans women registered amongst millions of amateur football players and no trans women in professional football. It's worth noting how significant a step backwards this is when it comes to trans rights in sports. In 2014, The FA published a policy on trans people in football, and it went as follows. The FA's policy on transgender and transsexual people playing football in their affirmed gender aims to ensure the game is enjoyed by anyone who wants to play, wherever possible. The FA believes gender identity should not preclude a person's participation in football. The FA is committed to inclusion and welcomes applications from all trans people to play football in their affirmed gender. The FA's general requirement is that the hormone-based and evidential requirements set out are met, and that the FA is satisfied that any potential gender-related advantage is minimised. Where these are not satisfied, in exceptional circumstances, the FA may decide at its absolute discretion that an individual may play in their affirmed gender if it is satisfied that there is no gender-related advantage or disadvantage, and that there is no risk to safe play or fair competition. So, in just over 10 years, we've gone from the FA welcoming trans people to play in their affirmed gender, albeit going through what sounds like some pretty invasive processes of making sure that they have gone through particular medical parts of the medical transition, to what will likely end up being, in practice, a ban on trans people in the sport. And this is such a far cry from the principles of a feminist movement. The idea that trans women need to be banned from women's sports rests on the idea that women are just biologically worse at sports than men. In fact, former FA chairman Lord Treesman said, women's sport, so quote, women's sport, as in all else, is defined by biology facts. The biology fact there being that women are biologically inferior. Now, I'm not an athlete, but I did watch Bend It Like Beckham, and it was my understanding that the reason for this perceived inferiority, in fact, predominantly lies in lack of investment, infrastructure, opportunities, and high-quality training at the grassroots level. I mean, let's take football as an example. 41% of women's football teams were only created in the last 5 years. 40% of women's footballers do not have access to their own pitch, 25% do not have changing room access, and 64% are not able to have a trainer for their team. Whereas when you look at other sports like gymnastics, where there is far higher grassroots funding and opportunity for women than men, women exceed men at the professional level. So it's highly ironic to me that in the name of supporting and protecting women, we are accepting this idea that this disparity in sports is entirely due to biological lack inherent to women, rather than, in a significant way, a social structure that disadvantages women athletes. And before you point out hormones or muscle mass, the fact is that the teeny tiny minority of trans women that compete in elite women's sports more than likely have had to go through a medical transition in order to compete. And the fact also is that there are also great biological disparities between men as a group and women as a group, which also determines how good they will be at a sport. Like if Serena Williams or Paula Radcliffe, for example, happen to be trans women, their entire career and the overwhelming superiority of them over their colleagues would not be considered down to their talent, dedication, and commitment, but to their transness. And that puts us in line with that quote from earlier, that women's sport is, as in all else, defined by biology, emphasis there being on as in all else, i.e. women's entire existence, what they can and can't do, should be seen through the lens of biology, and more specifically of biological inferiority, whereas men's existence can be seen holistically through the entirety of their personhood. But the question still remains, why have the most draconian interpretations of the Supreme Court ruling seem to proliferate so quickly? This is likely in part because of the Labour government's response. Here is Justice Secretary Shabana Mahmood speaking to Parliament's Human Rights Joint Committee.
I think it's disappointing that since then some individuals have sought to question the validity of the Supreme Court or cast aspersions, which is absolutely unacceptable.
So basically, she's saying that you can't even question the ruling. I mean, is part of being in a free and democratic society the ability to question things, to question rules? I mean, it's not it's not even like she's saying, oh, it's unacceptable to break the rules, even though I think, if someone's fundamental human rights and to use a toilet is being broken, then I think that, you should be able to just make a decision in that moment. But she's saying that you can't even question these rules. I mean, Stephen, are you surprised at how quickly things are deteriorating in this area?
No, I'm not really surprised at all. And what Shabana Mahmood said there kind of sums it up, because, let me tell you, she's not telling the truth, in my opinion. She's just lying about what is and isn't appropriate in this country. And she's sort of setting up the Supreme Court as though it's the final arbiter of what is or isn't permissible or correct in the UK. Isn't it? It's a court whose job is that had the job of interpreting two bits of probably quite badly drafted legislation made by politicians. It's not even the legal final arbiter of what's legally correct, because there's still at the moment the European Court of Human Rights, which will make sure that this judgment, for example, is consistent with the Human Rights Act. But it's certainly not the moral final word, and it's certainly not the political final word. The political final word comes from our legislators, from Parliament. And the reason this has deteriorated so quickly is because Mahmood and her colleagues are so anxious to get rid of this issue. They're so happy that there was a court that was prepared to clarify what the Equalities Act had to say. And the reason they want to clarify it is because they want someone else to clarify it, is because they are useless and terrified and not very committed to the difficult job of doing politics in a way which brings a just outcome for everybody. That's something that they just don't want to do at all. So yeah, it's no surprise to me that it's deteriorating so quickly, because they don't want to get involved. It's politically so sort of dangerous for them to get involved, and instead they've handed over to a court which has probably done the best it can, but the organization which will then and has already issued the guidelines which sort of tell organizations how they can best meet the requirements of the Equalities Act is the EHRC, the Equality and Human Rights Commission. And that is a commission that has been completely overtaken by, handed over to people with fairly right-wing inegalitarian views, and they've made absolutely no secret of that. To be honest, it's been very clear for a long time which way the EHRC would go on this. So yeah, it's this kind of collaboration, a collaboration of kind of silence or pitifulness between politicians that's meant that we've got to this stage where you now just have functionaries kind of unraveling a court's ruling and imposing procedures and guidelines on the rest of us without politicians having had any say in it except the original drafting of the law. That seems to me to be completely wrong and undemocratic, and it's really doesn't reflect very well on our political classes. But I will say something though about the case of sports. What's really striking to me is that the Equalities Act, as it was interpreted before this ruling, always had within it the ability for an organization to make an exclusion of trans women if it was a women's only group, or trans men if it was a men's only group, if there were good grounds to do so. And you can argue that in some cases there are good grounds to do so, and I don't think it's an elite sport. I don't think that there are going to be many trans women or trans men competing at the elite level, not least of all because games are, sports are often different, have different apparatus or are taught differently. Women's tennis has quite different techniques from men's tennis, which takes account of different body size, speed, agility, and so forth. Same with football. So those are skills that you're learning quite early on when you start playing those sports, and you do start playing them very early on if you want to get to the elite level. And then, of course, it makes absolutely no difference whether it's 8-year-olds or 9-year-olds or 10-year-olds. I can see that there might be an argument when you're talking about teenagers and then adults who aren't playing at the elite level. But as I said, the law already had the option for organizations to make exclusions on certain grounds. But what's really striking to me is that these sports organizations, they just blow whichever way the political wind blows. So, in the earlier incarnation of the FA's advice on trans women, it was a certain moment where a kind of neoliberal inclusivity was like really cool, and you could drape everything in the rainbow flag, and it was like really on brand. Now the winds have swung in a different way, and they are the very first to drop the celebration that they previously proclaimed so loudly in favor of a new, not even political reality. The political reality hasn't changed that much, but a new social reality in which they're reading the mood. And yeah, you can't expect these organizations to be, politically progressive in any way. What you can expect them to be is sort of self-publicizing and profit-seeking. And I just hope that all of us who are allies of trans people, who are in the queer community in one way or another, or connected through our friends to the queer community, remember that and don't give them a penny of our money going forward.
Yeah, I think for me, the one that really struck me was the 8-ball pool people coming out swinging. Sorry, what's the like gendered advantage with 8-ball pool? What, a men's eyesight better? Do they just have better hand-eye coordination? Like, why is that sport even gendered in the first place? Anyway, I think you're totally right, Stephen. And look, we're in a really, really difficult moment. But historically, we have been in similar moments, Jim Crow, the Jim Crow South, apartheid South Africa. I mean, the campaign of homophobia in this country that is still kind of under the surface, but really reached its peak, especially in the last 50 years with Thatcher. And we will get through this. I really believe that. And when we do get through it, I am keeping a long list of the people, the companies, the organizations that folded at the first signs of what feels like an emerging fascism. And I don't think that we should let those people forget it. There's that book that you mentioned in one of our conversations a few weeks ago, Stephen, by a Palestinian author, which the title is "One Day Everyone Will Be Against This." I am keeping notes because I think it's so important that we have, a historic memory of these things. And I've just seen that someone in the comments has said, comparing this trans debate to Jim Crow South is wild. And I actually really want to pick up on that because, look, when you are allowing the feelings of one group of people that have a relative amount of power over the marginalized group of people, when you allow their feelings of discomfort, of safety, to override the ability of another group of people to enact fundamental human rights, you are a segregationist. Like, in the Jim Crow South, look, obviously the intensity is very different. The legal encoding of it is very different. But ultimately, the reason that segregation lasted for so long was down to nothing else other than white people felt unsafe and uncomfortable sharing space with black people. That was the grounds of it. And they had this whole idea of, separate but equal, which sounds a lot like some of the things that have been coming out of the AHRC, which is that, okay, trans people can't use gendered bathrooms, so we should make sure that there is a third gender neutral bathroom or changing room or whatever, which obviously is entirely unworkable because you can't just redesign the whole entire infrastructure of society to create these third spaces. And also it would be deeply humiliating for trans people to not be able to use the spaces of their affirmed gender. But that's exactly, that falls in with this idea of we're not discriminating. We're saying separate but equal, segregated but equal. We're just saying that they should have their own space that's separate from the rest of us. But once you spatialize groups like this and you segregate spaces like this, you create spaces for one group of people that, whose rights are more secure than another, you are controlling the distribution of resources and rights. That's what spatializing these kinds of things does. So look, it's not a like-for-like comparison, but there are parallels in a segregationist approach to, having a group of people who have been framed as undesirable, so you just spatialize them out of society. Anyway, relations between India and Pakistan have always been strained, with the disputed territory of Kashmir a flashpoint for tensions between the two nuclear powers. And yesterday, escalating friction between the two countries appeared to be at risk of becoming armed conflict. This was Pakistan's Information Minister, Atwala Tarar.
Pakistan has credible intelligence that India intends carrying out military action against Pakistan in the next 24 to 36 hours on the pretext of baseless and concocted allegations of involvement in the Pahalgam incident.
The incident that Tarar referred to there was the mass murder of 26 people that took place last week near the town of Pahalgam in Kashmir. When India and Pakistan were partitioned in 1947, Kashmir became a disputed region. It's currently divided in two by what's called the line of control, with India controlling the south and Pakistan controlling the north and west of the region. And as you can see, the gun attack took place in the Baisaran Valley, south of Pahalgam and just inside Indian-administered Kashmir. Pahalgam is a popular tourist destination, and most of the 26 people killed were Indian nationals visiting a local beauty spot. Dozens more were injured when at least 4 gunmen opened fire on the tourists. It's the worst assault on Indian civilians since the 2008 Mumbai attacks, when 175 people were killed by militants from a jihadist organization based in Pakistan. Now, India says it's identified 2 of the attackers involved. Both are Pakistan nationals, and India has also accused Pakistan's government of supporting the terrorists. But Pakistan has denied any involvement in the attack, with a group called the Kashmir Resistance allegedly having claimed responsibility. Demonstrations against the killings have broken out across India, with protesters burning effigies and Pakistan flags while chanting "Down with Pakistan." Candlelight visuals have also taken place across the country, like this one in Kolkata, where people made pilgrimages to hold vigils in memory of the victims. And over the last week, a spiraling series of diplomatic and military interventions between the two countries has brought relations to its lowest point in recent history. India has revoked visas issued to Pakistan nationals, expelled military advisors, closed a border crossing, and suspended a crucial water-sharing treaty. Pakistan has responded in kind, while also banning Indian planes from Pakistan's airspace and suspending all trade with India. But beyond the diplomatic battle, the massacre at Pahalgam has also drawn comparisons in India to another event in which civilians were recently killed. Last Sunday, India's Sunday Guardian published this piece. In it, the author compared the Pahalgam attack to October 7th in Israel, arguing that it reveals an Islamic State strategy. Days later, the Times of India reported on former Pentagon official Michael Rubin's claim that Pakistan was emulating Hamas's tactics in Pahalgam. Earlier today, I was joined by Azad Essa, a journalist at Middle East Eye and author of the book Hostile Homelands, The New Alliance Between India and Israel. I began by asking him whether the conditions in Indian-controlled Kashmir can be compared to those in the occupied Palestinian territories.
Given what we have seen over the past 18 months, I think it would be wrong to make any comparisons with Kashmir, with the scale of genocide taking place in Gaza. There is a strong case to be made, however, about the situations in the occupied West Bank and in Indian-occupied Kashmir. And so even in the aftermath of this attack in Kashmir, the Indian government has conducted nighttime raids, killing several Kashmiris in unclear, opaque circumstances. They've demolished homes said to be belonging to families related to the suspects, have hounded people for their social media posts, have rounded up close to around 2,000 Kashmiris, including kids as young as 14, and have essentially placed parts of the valley on lockdown. And so if this sounds sort of like what you routinely hear about the West Bank, it is very, very similar. And there's a longer sort of backstory to this, and the similarities are quite striking. The issue, as we know it, in both Kashmir and Palestine, begin in 47, 48, with the withdrawal of the British and the partition of Palestine and the partition of the subcontinent. But I guess it's important to note that the pro-freedom struggles in Palestine and in Kashmir actually predate the creation of Israel and the creation of India and Pakistan. And so when we talk about the region of Jammu and Kashmir, which is what the entire region is known, and Palestine, since the formation of India and Israel, there have been bouts of ethnic cleansing in both places. There's been intense militarization, extrajudicial killings, torture, enforced disappearances, special legal frameworks that allow both armed forces to conduct their operations with impunity, to hold and detain even kids for whatever reason they deem necessary. Another striking matter that binds these two stories is that both are among the earliest issues raised at the United Nations, and they both continue to be unresolved. In the case of Kashmir, the UN Security Council voted in several resolutions that call for demilitarization and for a plebiscite for the people of Kashmir so that they can determine their own future. And this has never been held. In the case of Palestine, as we know, the UN has passed several resolutions to end the occupation, right, that began in 1967. Another similarity, and for many, this is something that is often ignored, is that both Palestine and Kashmir are occupied by countries that value their so-called democratic status. And they actually use the democratic status as a cudgel to shut down reportage and to escape scrutiny. And both have horrific records against journalists and civil society. Israel has blockaded Gaza and now conducted this live stream genocide. India has cut Kashmir's communications off from the rest of the world and have actually placed several Kashmiris on travel bans. Both Kashmir and Palestine have seen both non-violent resistance as well as armed resistance in response, yet these efforts, whether they're violent or non-violent, have been ignored or vilified by the international community. I know I've said a lot, but these are the broad similarities. But I want to mention, a couple of other dimensions. India uses Israeli methods in Kashmir, from surveillance to automatic weapons and sensors on the de facto border with Pakistan. Also in 2019, Narendra Modi, India's Prime Minister, revoked 2 special articles from the Indian Constitution that protected Kashmir from demographic change. So since then, there has been a shift in land laws and domicile laws that now grants Indians to come into Kashmir and become residents with the ability to purchase land. Now, this is important because this means that ultimately that when you get people to come in and you somehow have a vote later on, then suddenly there's no issue because the population has changed, right? And here the effort has been to build Hindu-only settlements, a direct duplication of Jewish-only settlements in the occupied West Bank. Moreover, there have been attempts to change the ecology of the land in the same way Israel has done so in Gaza and in the West Bank. So in Palestine, Israel has removed olive trees, right? And they have replaced them with pine trees, for example, to sort of remove history and memory, and to create a reimagined environment so that it looks more European. Now, this is part of a colonial impetus, right, to destroy the link between people and the land, as well as to destroy the agricultural yield so that the farmers actually become more dependent on the occupying power. And we've seen that with the US doing the same in Hawaii and Puerto Rico. And this is also currently happening in Kashmir.
And kind of on the same theme there, we've seen some instances of Indian media trying to draw comparisons between October 7th and the Pahalgam attacks. Is this a widespread interpretation? And what do you think is the purpose of drawing that parallel?
Yeah, in the immediate aftermath of the attack on April 22nd in Kashmir, in Pahalgam, the Indian media immediately pinned the blame on Pakistan, and it has since been leading the charge for an Indian military response to Pakistan. So beating the drums of war would be, to put it lightly, right? One of the ways it sought to build consensus for a military response was to immediately invoke the events of October 7th, right? The Hamas-led attacks on Israel in 2023. Now, by doing so, it was communicating how severe the incident was, that it was an attack on India's ideas, civilization, its religion, and it was immediately signaling that it warranted a massive military response. And whereas most of the world is watching in horror at the events unfolding in Gaza, we know with several countries actually outlining, even at this moment, how Israel has been conducting or blocking aid and using methods of starvation together with its bombing campaign to conduct this genocide. The Indian mainstream media was actually raising it as a kind of model to replicate. And so we have seen media and political figures call for, quote, no red lines, for, quote, a disproportionate response. And we've even seen these figures calling for India actually ignoring international conventions on human rights and the like, and to do so, right? So none of this is incidental or new. The Indian mainstream media has long vacated its function as a watchdog of the state. It's day in and day out a kind of jingoistic medium. Think of it as essentially a kind of low-budget Bollywood production of the news, right? The mainstream media have also shown little interest in asking questions or providing context as to why an incident of this type may have taken place. In other words, the media have essentially worked at the behest of the Indian state, and this lack of introspection or healthy skepticism of their government's position, we might say, has only helped manufacture a desire for revenge and hate against Muslims in India, against Kashmiri Muslims, as well as against Pakistan. So to what end? I guess you could say, it's to dehumanize Muslims, Kashmiris and Pakistan, and to justify, a massive military action or even the further securitization of the Indian state.
And we're going to show you a video now, Azad, with the Israeli ambassador. If you could just have a look at this interview, and then I'm going to ask a follow-up question about it.
Prime Minister Narendra Modi has reiterated India's resolve to bring the perpetrators of terror to justice, not just the perpetrators of terror, but also those who backed them. How difficult has Israel's journey been, based on what happened to your country in October 7? What are lessons that Israel has learned, and what are steps that India must take for swift and decisive international action to ensure that a state sponsor of radical Islamist terror like Pakistan can be held to account?
Well, Gaurav, I think that your Prime Minister and the entire government have their experience they need in order to tackle the problem. We can work together both quietly on the security channels and I think maybe more openly on the diplomatic channels in order to promote cooperation against terrorists at the national level, at the international level, and we are determined to do that.
So in that interview with the Israeli ambassador, he talked about working quietly with India on security. How deep do those quiet links go?
Well, these are links that go back decades. It depends how much time you have to discuss them. Secret military ties started in the 60s, and by the early 70s, Mossad and Indian Foreign Intelligence, the agency called RAW, were already working with each other. Military ties really take off once India normalized ties with Israel in 1992, with Delhi actually buying drones from Israel as far back as 1995. After 9/11, India joined the war on terror, and both countries speak of facing a threat from Islamic fundamentalism and terrorism, as defined by the so-called war on terror. In 2008, the city of Mumbai faces an attack in which 170 people are killed, including several Israelis. And this event sees India and Israel grow closer over mutual interest in building security and intelligence links. So what you hear from the ambassador there is something that was discussed each time there's some type of infraction, each time there's some type of attack. So that's nothing new. And so it's in 2008 also that India begins to purchase even more arms, including, importantly, the tactics and the methodology of homeland security from the Israelis. But it's from 2014, when Narendra Modi comes to power, that the relationship emerges out of the shadows into a kind of full-scale attempt to build a strategic alliance. Modi comes in, into power on the mandate of turning India into a Hindu Rashtra or Hindu state. And Modi explicitly wants to turn India into a version of Israel, a kind of ethno-nationalist, militaristic state that wants to wield influence over its neighborhood as well as the world. And so over the past decade or so, India has emerged as the biggest buyer of Israeli weapons, has begun to co-manufacture Israeli weapons in factories across India. And it's kind of being seen as a factory for the West when it comes to consumer and industrial products, as well as military products. In fact, you can today think of India as potentially mass producing Israeli arms. That's where we are at. In fact, India is absolutely complicit in this genocide as well in Gaza. It has refused to sign on to an arms embargo or to join the ICJ case that accuses Israel of genocide. It has sent combat drones to Israel for potential use in Gaza. It has sent workers to replace Palestinian workers and has offered tremendous diplomatic cover for Israel over the past 18 months. And so when it comes to October 7th, Indian leaders and the mainstream media played a huge role in spreading Israeli disinformation, right, at that time. The Indian media, in fact, framed the attacks of October 7th. Now, I'm not talking about the attacks in Kashmir, I'm talking about the attacks in Israel. The Indian media framed the attacks as India's war as well, and warned that an attack of this type could happen in India. And so it's actually quite remarkable because they said back then that they wanted Israel to have the right to respond in any way deemed necessary. And they kind of inferred that they wanted that same right to respond if an attack of a similar type should occur. Now, that attack has taken place, and conveniently so, right? And so they are both invoking October 7th and also asking for sort of zero red lines in order to respond.
And how likely do you think drawing these parallels, as you mentioned, is actually going to succeed in building that consent for larger military action against Pakistan? I mean, it's clearly because Hamas is not a nuclear power, but Pakistan is. So it's a fundamentally different situation.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one has to understand the psyche of Hindu nationalists, but not just Hindu nationalists, it's also the Indian secular nationalist as well. Pakistan is seen as a failure. The creation of Pakistan is seen as a failure of the Indian independence movement. And so there's a deep sense of sort of wanting it back, or turning it into Gaza as a result. So political parties across the spectrum are baying for blood at this time. And are in many ways sort of united in the call for revenge or at least punitive actions on Pakistan. Now, of course, Pakistan is not Palestine. It's not Gaza. Pakistan is a nuclear power with strong allies like China, who have deep investments in the country. And yet at the same time, this hasn't stopped the Indian state as well as Hindu nationalists from fantasizing, right, that it can turn it into a Gaza. India will take action against Pakistan, but everyone seems to be hoping that it could be some type of controlled response and that it doesn't escalate into an all-out war, because that would obviously be horrific.
That was journalist Azad Essa speaking with me earlier today. Irish hip-hop trio Kneecap have been hit with a wave of gig cancellations. That's after two controversial videos emerged of statements made by the band at previous gigs. The first was this from November 2023.
You're Tories. The only good Tory is a dead Tory.
So they said, they're fucking Tories. The only good Tory is a dead Tory. Kill your local MP. That's just in case you were listening and you didn't quite catch what they said. The second video was from November 2024. Now, expressing support for Hamas or Hezbollah in the UK is illegal. They are both defined in law as proscribed terror groups. The videos both surfaced after Kneecap provoked the ire of the Israel lobby with a performance at Coachella where they had these statements projected on stage. One read, "Fuck Israel, free Palestine," and the other said, "Israel is committing genocide against the Palestinian people. It is being enabled by the US government, who arm and fund Israel despite their war crimes." Those projections led to Sharon Osbourne, of all people, calling for Kneecap to have their visas revoked. And the backlash to the Coachella gig and the clips from previous gigs has included Kneecap having 5 gigs in Germany cancelled, as well as one at the Eden Project in Cornwall. There's also been pressure, including from MPs, for Glastonbury to pull them from the bill. And the UK counter-terrorism police are investigating the band for their statements about Hamas and Hezbollah. Under pressure, Kneecap released the following statement. They want you to believe words are more harmful than genocide. Establishment figures desperate to silence us have combed through hundreds of hours of footage and interviews, extracting a handful of words from months or years ago to manufacture moral hysteria. Let us be unequivocal. We do not and have never supported Hamas or Hezbollah. We condemn all attacks on civilians, always. It is never okay. We know this more than anyone, given our nation's history. We also reject any suggestion that we would seek to incite violence against any MP or individual, ever. An extract of footage deliberately taken out of all context is now being exploited and weaponized as if it were a call to action. This distortion is not only absurd, it is a transparent effort to derail the real conversation. All 2 million Palestinian people in Gaza are currently being starved to death by Israel. And their manager has spoken to RTE.
You know, we said a video emerged. A video didn't emerge. There was a concerted campaign emanating from the US to analyse every single thing that Kneecap have ever said in 7 years of performances. They've gigged to hundreds of thousands of people in about 20 countries, hundreds of gigs. And why this happened, and you mentioned at the intro, is around what they said at Coachella. And what they said at Coachella was the right thing to say. It's something that we've said at Leeds Reading, at Glastonbury. We've said it in Dublin and Belfast. And what it is a message aimed at governments who are enabling the genocide in Gaza. And what really, really scared the state of Israel and what led to this campaign is the reaction of young people in America, young people who aren't willing to support a genocide and young people who have empathy and sympathy towards the Palestinian people.
And I hear you on that, Danny. Let me come back on that. I suppose if we look at last night's statement, you said, let us be unequivocal in it. We do not and have never supported Hamas or Hezbollah. But it's only last November, Daniel, when one of the band members was clearly heard and can be seen shouting, "Up Hezbollah, up Hamas." So I suppose that's what the current controversy is about. So even within the context of what you're saying, when is it ever right to say something like that?
Well, we're in the space, I'll address those comments in a second. We're in the space now of moral hysteria and moral outrage. And you have a band being held to a higher moral account than politicians who are ignoring international law. Keir Starmer was an international lawyer. He said that Israel had a right to cut water and food into Gaza. They do not. Children are starving to death, and we're spending 6 or 7 days speaking about Kneecap. We spent less than a day speaking about 50 executed medics. And what I'd say on your point there, it's not about whether somebody supports or condemns any group. That's not part of the discussion.
But isn't it, in a way? I mean, for somebody, hang on, to say, up Hamas or Hezbollah, you even know many Palestinians feel they're victims of Hamas.
And I suppose what's lost in this, why are the Palestinians where they are today? They're where they are today because there's been a wholesale denial of their rights as human beings on this planet. And to focus in and say to somebody, do you condemn or do you support, is away from the core message. And the core message should be, do you understand? Do you understand why somebody after 77 years of a brutal, violent occupation would resort to violence? Okay. But it's a key point here to make is, and it's one that's left aside, the rest of the world are ignoring Palestinians, their human rights. We need to acknowledge that there is an enshrined legal right to resistance.
I'm now joined by Tadhg Hickey. Tadhg, what do you make of the media's coverage of this fallout and also of Kneecap's response?
Well, first of all, really nice to see you again, my friend. I think the whole thing is a bit of a pantomime, to be honest, and the only people that are enjoying the show are Israel. I think Daniel said it so beautifully there. It's another example of distraction, and I think the British state in particular is often guilty of these types of obfuscation and distraction techniques, particularly when it comes to Irish people. I mean, we've all spent the last 9 or 10 days talking about the geopolitical thinking of a hip-hop trio. And all the while, Israel continues doing its deeds in the killing fields. I think, to be honest, the hysteria is more to do with the British state and the US government trying to rile up people to look the other way and to not reflect on their direct complicity in the genocide in Gaza. I think it's more incumbent on the British state at the moment to look into its own role in that genocide. I mean, I think it was just yesterday that the UK, from its base in Cyprus, transported weapons and infantry to Israel. That's the big story. I mean, Israel is on trial. It's suspicions of genocide hang over the state, and we're all talking about the private and sometimes public, I suppose, acknowledgement of resistance from a group of musicians. I think it's farcical. But I mean, if I was Kneecap right now, I'd also be thinking this has done us the world of good. I mean, you couldn't pay for this type of coverage. I think their plays on Spotify have gone up like tenfold. So I think when the dust settles, they will have a massive boost to their career. You cancel gigs in the short term and you just create demand. I mean, that makes them the most desirable act in the world right now. And also, more importantly, they will be shown to be on the right side of history. I'm very, very certain of that. And this British government will very much be on the wrong side of history. And I would like to think that they will be held accountable as the war criminals that they are. Yeah, I'm really struck there by you comparing, the 5-6 days that the media has spent talking about this, something that happened at a concert however many months or years ago, and the sort of one day that it took for the media to get over 15 aid workers being killed. And particularly in the context of the genocide that's taking place, it feels like every day that we spend not talking about how to stop this genocide from happening and the role of the British government in facilitating it, and is just a day where life is being lost before our very eyes. And that's almost why this kind of diversion and time wasting is so egregious. So Kneecap's manager has shared examples of other people using violent imagery in the context of entertainment and it being viewed as okay. In 2020, comedian Finn Taylor joked on Have I Got News For You about bombing Glastonbury to kill Corbyn supporters. This is what Finn Taylor said. People think that Bob Dylan's the greatest musician that ever lived, and you listen to some of it and it's awful. But then people are so dogmatic and say he's like the greatest musician. People who like Corbyn, it's 200,000 people in the Labour Party that are fanatics? So all you've got to do next year is bomb Glastonbury. Hopefully Dylan's headlining, 2 birds, 1 stone. Thing is with right-wingers, no matter how much they try to be funny, they just I'm like, where is the punchline? Anyway. And this was the BBC's response. After more than 30 years on air, Have I Got News For You is a well-established comedy series that has built a reputation for irreverent humour and satire. Regular viewers expect the panellists to make jokes and understand that contributions are intended to be funny and amusing, and this edition was no exception. It was clear that comedian Finn Taylor was talking about an utterly absurd scenario in which he compared Jeremy Corbyn to Bob Dylan and was in no way whatsoever to be taken seriously. I don't think it was the comparison between Jeremy Corbyn and Bob Dylan that people found a little bit tasteless there. But anyway, Kneecap have also now received a lot of support from other musicians. This was from Massive Attack. If senior politicians can find neither the time nor the words to condemn, say, the murder of 15 voluntary aid workers in Gaza, or the illegal starvation of a civilian population as a method of warfare, or the killings of thousands and thousands of children in the same territory by a state in possession of the highest precision weapons in the world, how much notice should a music festival take of their moral advice on booking performance acts? Language matters, of course. The hideous murders of elected politicians Joe Cox and David Ames means there's no scope for flippancy or recklessness. But do politicians and right-wing journalists strategically concocting more outrage over the stage utterings of a young punk band while simultaneously obfuscating or even ignoring a genocide happening in real time, including the killing of journalists in unprecedented numbers, have any right to intimidate festival events into acts of political censorship? Kneecap are not the story. Gaza is the story. Genocide is the story.
Kneecap's label, Heavenly Records, also put out this statement. The past week has seen a clear, concerted attempt to censor and ultimately deplatform the band Kneecap. In a democracy, no political figures or political parties should have the right to dictate who does and does not play at music festivals or gigs that will be enjoyed by thousands of people. The question of agreeing with Kneecap's political views is irrelevant. It is in the key interests of every artist that all creative expression be protected in a society that values culture, and this interference campaign is condemned and ridiculed. That letter has now been signed by dozens of recording artists, including Paul Weller, Primal Scream, and the Pogues. Tadhg, I know that you don't have much longer with us, but just wanted to know what your responses were to that question of deplatforming and free speech. I mean, we've been told for the past 10 years that right-wing comedians and right-wing musicians should be able to abuse whoever they want verbally on stage in the name of free speech. I mean, it's interesting how quickly that excuse has run thin, right?
I think, as you beautifully illustrated there, I always feel with conservatives that they're just interested in free speech when they're speaking. That's always the impression that I get. And I just think, to go back to the British state for a moment, I mean, as an Irish person, the British state, its collusion with loyalist gangs in Ireland is responsible for the deaths of many, many Irish people. And this Labour government, right up till today, people can Google the murder of Sean Brown, right up till today, are continuing to have this policy of secrecy and obfuscation and denying actual friends of mine in the north of Ireland justice. They are victims of British state violence. The dogs on the street know it. There's a cover-up been going on for a long time. The Legacy Act last year was kind of almost the final nail in the coffin of that obfuscation. The Labour Party promised that they were going to do differently, and actually they're just carrying on the same spirit of secrecy and whatnot. So I just really feel that we in Ireland particularly would take the British government a little bit more seriously when it's trying to police the words of a hip-hop trio, if it actually looked into its own deeds with an honesty and tried to bring about justice for the victims of its state violence. So I think I'm just sad that more people in the entertainment world don't stand up the way Kneecap have. I'm sad that fellow comedians don't take a stand. I mean, like, I grew up listening to punk acts and whatnot, who all would have something to say at this momentous moment in history and this great injustice of the 21st century. And sadly, I think Kneecap are, for young working class lads from the north, they've been a little bit on their own in this space. I'm glad to see other acts coming out and support them now, but they've taken a very brave stance, and I think we in Ireland really support them. And yeah, all credit to them, because it hasn't been easy. And I think trawling through hours of footage, I mean, like you said, with the example from Have I Got News For You, it's a gig. Like, they're quite an ironical, satirical act. I'm sure that, you know, the moment that they were talking about the Tories in that way, the lights didn't go down. You know, like, Mo Farah didn't look into the whites of the audience's eyes and say, kill a Tory, kill a Tory. It's art. Like, if somebody trawled through like hours of footage of my gigs, I'd be in Guantanamo Bay. You know what I mean? It's farcical, it's obfuscation, and yeah, the right people are not in the dock, as always. The right people are not in the dock.
Yeah, double standards all over the place. I mean, thank you so much for joining me, Tadhg. That was a really good conversation. And yeah, thank you so much for joining us.
Take care. See you again, guys. Thank you.
See you later. And also, thank you for joining me, Stephen. It was lovely to have you back in the co-hosting seat.
It was very nice to be here, Dalia. But before we go, can I just leave you with one little bit of trivia, which some people in our audience might know, but the Sharon Osbourne thing of their visas should be revoked is like so ridiculous, because, you know, what did they do? They displayed some political language in lights at other concerts. They said some political things in the context of a theatrical, musical, satirical work. Do you know what her husband, Ozzy Osbourne, did in 1982? He bit the head off a live bat on stage during a concert. Like, that got him really, really famous, and it got her really, really rich. I mean, to me, that just seems, like punk is dead if you've become Sharon Osbourne at this point.
Thanks for putting me off my dinner tonight. And thank you, everyone, for tuning in. And thanks for watching this evening. Make sure you come back tomorrow night for another live stream from 6 p.m. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.